Medieval peasants faced significantly more challenging circumstances than many today. Their survival depended on their ability to acquire or cultivate whatever sustenance they could find. The following 15 inexpensive meals, while hardly elegant, sustained generations through plagues, famines, and relentless hard labor. Pottage holds the top spot on this list. If you've ever had a house guest who just wouldn't leave, you might understand pottage's role in a medieval peasant diet. Unlike modern house guests, however, medieval peasants actively wanted pottage to stick around. This legendary soup was the ultimate embodiment of resourcefulness in the Middle Ages, simmering endlessly over the fire like the most patient of cooks. Pottage was not just any soup, it was a dietary cornerstone for the medieval peasantry, representing the ultimate set-it-and-forget-it meal. Unlike modern quick meals, pottage was a sustained, evolving culinary strategy, a practical response to the harsh realities of medieval life. Essentially, pottage was a thick, hearty stew that could easily last for days, even weeks. The cooking pot rarely left the hearth, with new ingredients continually added as others were consumed. A never-ending buffet with limited options. The base was usually the cheapest available grain, barley, oats, or rye, boiled until it formed a thick porridge. While all social classes consumed some variation of pottage, a vast gulf existed between peasant pottage and that enjoyed by the nobility. Wealthy households enhanced their pottage with expensive imported spices, small quantities of meat, and even wine. Peasant pottage, however, relied on local herbs, garlic, parsley, sage, for flavoring. On special occasions or after a successful hunt, a peasant family might add a small piece of salt pork or bacon to their pot, infusing the entire pot with flavor. The rendered fat rising to the top provided precious calories during times of hardship. Some historians suggest that medieval peasants consumed 2 to 3 pints of pottage daily, making it the true fuel of the feudal system. Certainly not social media worthy, but it sustained generations. Bread is a universally consumed food, transcending time and cultures. However, the bread available to the medieval peasantry differed significantly from what we typically consume today. Forget fluffy white bread or artisanal sourdough. Medieval peasant bread was generally dark, dense, and as hard as the lives of those who consumed it. Primarily composed of rye or barley grains grown in poor soil, unsuitable for wheat. These loaves bore little resemblance to our modern conceptions of bread. The differences were not limited to the type of grain used. The entire process reflected the stark realities of social inequality. Firstly, the grain itself was often of poor quality. The best wheat was reserved for the nobility and clergy who could afford it. Secondly, peasants paid substantial fees to have their grain milled at the Lord's mill. To reduce these costs, many peasants would incorporate fillers into their dough. Ground peas, beans, acorns, chestnuts, and, during times of extreme hardship, even ground tree bark or straw. The sheer quantity of bread consumed by the average peasant was staggering. Records from medieval England show that a working man might consume 2 to 3 pounds of bread daily, providing over 60% of his daily caloric intake. Women and children ate proportionally similar amounts. This wasn't gluttony, it was necessity. Heavy labor in the fields demanded a massive caloric intake, and bread provided these calories inexpensively. The baking process itself highlighted the social divisions of medieval society. Wealthy households could afford daily fresh bread. Peasants, lacking private ovens, typically baked only once a week in communal ovens or made flatbreads cooked on simple hearthstones. These weekly loaves hardened and molded with time, often requiring soaking in pottage or ale to become palatable by the end of the week. Perhaps the most alarming aspect of medieval bread was the potential for contamination. Rye, the peasant's grain of choice in many areas, was susceptible to ergot fungus, a naturally occurring hallucinogen containing compounds similar to LSD. Entire villages sometimes experienced mass hallucinations, convulsions, and even death from what was known as St. Anthony's fire, a condition caused by ergot poisoning. Medieval people were unaware that their daily bread was to blame. Despite these dangers and shortcomings, bread held significant cultural importance in medieval society. Bread theft was severely punished, and wasting it was seen as deeply sinful. A medieval meal began and ended with bread, and during famines, families could survive for weeks on bread alone. though the definition of bread became increasingly creative during these times. The dark, dense loaves that fueled medieval labor were rarely eaten on their own. However, when peasants possessed something to enhance their bread, it was commonly a simple preparation requiring minimal effort. After a long workday in the fields, gruel offered a minimal level of sustenance, essentially boiled water with a grain added. Gruel was, quite simply, survival food, maximizing meager resources. The recipe, if it can be called that, was supremely straightforward. Take oats, barley, or whatever grain scraps remained. Add water until the mixture is thin, then cook until edible. A lucky peasant might add a pinch of salt. The result was a bland, watery substance that filled the stomach without satisfying any other human needs. Gruel differed from pottage in its intentional thinness and from porridge in its lack of substance. Records indicate that during the most severe famines, monasteries feeding the poor could stretch a single cup of oats into a gruel serving 10 people. Less than 2 tablespoons of grain per person, hardly a substantial meal. Interestingly, gruel wasn't just for the destitute. Monks across medieval Europe regularly consumed gruel as a part of their religious practices. Monastery kitchen records from the 12th century show monks eating gruel during fasting periods, some abbeys documenting twice daily gruel consumption during Lent. Their bowls might contain honey or dried fruit, luxuries unimaginable to the average peasant. For the sick and elderly, gruel served as a form of medieval health care. Individuals too weak or ill to consume bread or more substantial foods were often fed gruel until they recovered or sadly succumbed. Medieval medical texts recommend gruel for ailments ranging from fevers to toothaches, with the occasional addition of herbs or wine for medicinal purposes. Of course, peasants rarely had access to such enhanced versions. Infants weaned from breast milk often transitioned directly to gruel, creating generations of Europeans unfamiliar with the concept of baby food. Court records occasionally mention children who died of malnutrition despite regularly receiving gruel, a grim testament to its nutritional inadequacies. When gruel became a luxury due to extreme grain shortages, medieval peasants turned to another reliable crop that thrived in poor soil and could be stored throughout the winter: turnips. This humble root vegetable once held a paramount position in medieval kitchens. While today's shoppers might overlook them, turnips sustained countless peasants through centuries of hardship. Turnips' success stemmed from several key factors. First, their adaptability. They grew almost anywhere, even poor soil. Their short growing season meant little time investment from already busy farmers, and their ability to tolerate neglect meant even the most overworked farmers could have a relatively reliable crop. A single turnip seed could yield up to 15 pounds of food, making them exceptionally efficient. Turnip stew became medieval fast food, quick, filling, and available year-round. The basic recipe was minimal effort. Chop turnips, add water, boil until soft, season with salt if available. Turnips also excelled in storage. Long before refrigeration, medieval peasants stored turnips in cool, dry cellars where they remained edible for months. Some villages even dug specialized turnip pits, underground storage chambers lined with straw, keeping turnips fresh from harvest until late spring. Records from an English manor in 1286 note that turnips stored in this way sustained village families for 7 months after the harvest. Unlike many vegetables, the entire turnip was edible. The roots went into stews, the leaves into pottage, and even the flowers could be eaten in the spring. Nothing went to waste. Records suggest a family of 4 needed about 200 pounds of turnips to survive the winter, a goal achievable in a relatively small garden plot. Turnips even held medicinal value in medieval folk practices. Turnip juice was used for coughs and poultices for skin ailments. One monastic medical text claims turnips could alleviate winter melancholy, an early recognition of the nutritional value of fresh vegetables during vitamin-deficient winter months. Of course, consuming turnips daily had drawbacks. Medieval writers sometimes bemoaned the monotony of peasant diets, one noting that the poor eat turnips until their skin takes on the power of the root itself. Another drawback was more olfactory than aesthetic. Turnips, particularly when reheated repeatedly, developed a distinctive odor that permeated medieval homes. While turnips dominated the medieval peasant diet, they were seldom consumed in isolation. Another vegetable duo frequently accompanied them, offering both nutritional diversity and a welcome change of pace from the turnip's monotony: Cabbage and onions formed the backbone of peasant cooking across Europe, providing desperately needed flavor to otherwise bland meals while simultaneously testing medieval ventilation systems to their limits. Cabbage's popularity stemmed from its productivity. A single plant could grow exceptionally large with heads weighing up to 15 pounds. Old farm records show that 10 cabbage plants could feed a family for months, occupying minimal garden space. Outer leaves could be harvested throughout the growing season, while the inner head continued to grow, effectively self-replacing the consumed leaves. This self-renewing nature made cabbage incredibly valuable. Fresh cabbage could last for weeks in cool storage, but soured cabbage, sauerkraut, could last for months. Archaeologists have unearthed old cabbage pits in medieval villages where communities preserved their harvests. One pit from a 14th century village contained remains from over 100 cabbages, enough to sustain several families throughout the winter. Onions, tough and resilient, thrived in poor soil and required minimal storage preparation. Old gardening manuals recommended planting onions near other crops to deter pests, making them doubly useful in small peasant gardens where space was at a premium. The combination of cabbage and onions transformed otherwise plain food into something flavorful. Boiled together, they made a simple side dish. Added to soup, they enhanced flavor. And incorporated with small pieces of meat, they created something resembling a festive meal. Old tax records show cabbage and onions were occasionally accepted as partial payment for small debts, indicating their significant value in the medieval peasant economy. The digestive consequences of consuming large quantities of these vegetables were well known. Court records from numerous villages cite problems caused by excessive flatulence after cabbage-heavy meals. One monastery even banned cabbage on days with important guests, hinting that post-meal flatulence wasn't considered conducive to polite social interaction. Interestingly, physicians of the time were often skeptical of vegetables. Wealthy people's doctors frequently warned against consuming what they termed poor people's plants, like cabbage, claiming they would cause sadness and sluggish thinking. Yet the poor, consuming significantly less food than the wealthy and working extremely hard, suffered from fewer food-related illnesses. Despite their benefits, cabbage and onions alone couldn't provide all the nutrients a hardworking peasant needed. Even with bread and pottage, their diet lacked sufficient protein. Medieval peasants instinctively recognized this, leading them to seek out protein wherever they could find it. Peas and beans were the unsung heroes of the medieval peasant diet, providing the necessary protein for sustaining long days of toil in the fields. Dried peas alone contained approximately 25% protein by weight, making them exceptionally valuable during the winter when meat was scarce or unavailable. A small plot of peas could yield up to 60 pounds of dried peas, sufficient to feed a family through the leanest months. Growing these protein-rich crops was straightforward. Peas and beans fixed nitrogen in the soil, enabling their cultivation in fields where other crops had depleted the nutrients. Smart peasants often planted them between rows of other vegetables or after harvesting grain, maximizing the yield from the same land. The most common method of preparing peas and beans was to mash them. After soaking dried peas or beans overnight, peasants would boil them until soft before mashing them into a thick paste. Salt, if available, and perhaps wild herbs were added. The result resembled baby food, but provided a concentrated nutritional punch that kept workers going through 12-hour workdays. During the harshest times, this pea and bean mash might be the principal rather than a secondary dish. Records from an English village during the famine of 1315 note families surviving for weeks on little more than this mash and small beer, with bread becoming a luxury. Monks throughout Europe relied heavily on these humble legumes. Church rules banning meat on numerous days of the year made peas and beans essential in monastic kitchens. Account books from a large abbey reveal they stocked over 3,000 pounds of dried peas annually for just 40 monks. That's 75 pounds per monk annually, or more than 1 pound every single day. Storage was another advantage, and while fresh peas and beans lasted mere days, dried versions could keep for years if stored correctly. Peasant homes often contained clay pots or wooden barrels of dried legumes, providing insurance against poor harvests. One archaeological dig at a peasant home uncovered edible peas from storage pots dating back 10 years. The principal downside, similar to cabbage, was the considerable flatulence they caused. Medieval health guides warned against overindulging in beans before church services or court appearances. One old joke recounts a bean farmer who couldn't sell his crop because he'd consumed too many samples on his way to market. While peas and beans ensured peasants were healthy enough to work, they were not particularly exciting to consume day after day. Medieval peasants, like people in any time, craved dietary variety. They eagerly sought out any opportunity to add additional items to their cooking pots. Sometimes those opportunities came from unexpected sources. The overriding principle of medieval peasant meat consumption was, eat what you can get. While nobles feasted on roasted venison and plump capons, peasants generally made do with what was left over. The organs, feet, heads, and scraps deemed undesirable by others. Medieval butchering practices strictly dictated which cuts went to whom. The lord of the manor claimed the best. Townspeople with money secured the decent cuts, leaving the rest for the peasants. However, medieval peasants were exceptionally skilled at transforming these scraps into palatable and nutritious meals. Consider the humble pig's head. After a pig slaughter, peasant families frequently received the head as partial payment for their work. Nothing went to waste. Cheeks provided small but tender portions of meat. Ears were cleaned, sliced, and fried. The snout and lips were used in jellied dishes, and even the brain was scooped out and scrambled like eggs. Larger animals provided even more awful options. Cow stomachs, cleaned and boiled, became containers for haggis-like mixtures of grain and bits of heart or liver. Sheep's lungs, sliced thinly and fried with onions, offered a quick meal following a butchering day. Blood from any animal could be transformed into blood pudding when mixed with grain and cooked in a cleaned intestinal casing. Game animals too small for the Lord's table often ended up in peasant cooking pots. Whole squirrels, hedgehogs, and even rats, during times of extreme need, provided small quantities of meat to flavor otherwise plain vegetable dishes. Records from one medieval village during a harsh winter document peasants trapping and consuming badgers and foxes, animals normally considered inedible. The unwritten rule was simple. If it couldn't kill you, it was food. This waste-nothing approach maximized the use of limited amounts of animal protein, feeding many families from what would otherwise have been discarded. A single cow's organs could provide meals for multiple families, while the prime cut sustained only one noble household for a day or two. Court records reveal that theft of offal was severely punished, sometimes with the same penalties as stealing more valuable cuts. One medieval English town records a man being fined 2 weeks' wages for stealing a sheep's pluck, heart, liver, and lungs. Preservation of offal was necessarily swift due to its rapid spoilage. Without refrigeration, smoking, salting, and immediate cooking were essential. Many offal dishes were therefore linked to butchering days, consumed within hours of the animal slaughter in an almost ritualistic feast. For those living near coastlines or rivers, another source of protein was readily available. Medieval people didn't have drive-thrus, but they did have salted herring, the original grab-and-go meal. This preserved fish was the fast food of the Middle Ages, ready to eat without cooking and preserved with enough salt to induce thirst for days. Herring became the fish of choice for medieval peasants for 3 key reasons. They traveled in immense schools, were easy to catch, and could be effectively preserved using simple salting techniques. Medieval fishing records reveal the massive scale of the herring industry. During peak season, a single fishing fleet from Great Yarmouth in England could land over 40 million herring in just a few weeks, enough to provide 7 fish to each person in medieval England. The salting process was rapid but pungent. Fresh herring spoiled within a day. Fishing boats carried salt, and workers gutted, salted, and packed the fish into barrels directly on deck. The resulting smell was so powerful that herring processing areas in medieval towns were isolated, safely downwind from residential areas. For peasants, salted herring provided several key advantages. First, it solved the problem of meat restrictions during religious fasts. The church banned meat on Fridays during Lent and many other holy days, sometimes amounting to more than half the year. Fish remained permissible. The cheapest herring was simply gutted and salted. Those with extra money might buy red herring, salted and then smoked for days until reddish brown and even more durable. Smoking reduced saltiness and added a stronger flavor. Tax records paint a striking picture of herring consumption in medieval Europe. The small Baltic island of Scania processed more than 300 million herring annually during peak years. A single monastery in York purchased 15,000 herring annually to feed only 30 monks. That's 500 fish per monk, per year or more than 1 herring per day. Of course, eating fish daily became monotonous. Medieval cooks devised ways to make it more interesting, chopping it into spreads, incorporating it into pies, or soaking it to reduce saltiness before cooking. Regardless of preparation, however, herring breath remained an occupational hazard of medieval life. After a salty meal, medieval peasants needed something to quench their thirst. Their preferred beverage wasn't water. Medieval water sources were frequently contaminated. Wells located near outhouses, rivers carrying upstream sewage, and most people were unaware that polluted water could cause illness. They simply observed that those who drank from certain water sources often fell ill, while those who drank ale generally remained healthier. The brewing process accidentally solved this problem. Boiling water during brewing killed harmful bacteria, and the alcohol helped inhibit the growth of new contaminants. Medieval people didn't understand the science, but they observed the outcome. Ale drinkers were healthier than water drinkers. Medieval ale was not the potent beverage of modern times. Small ale or small beer contained just enough alcohol, 1 to 3% for preservation, comparable to modern light beers. This weak brew was a daily drink for everyone, including children. Medieval children drank ale with meals, though this should be understood as flavorful water rather than intoxicating drink. Medieval records indicate that many adult workers received daily allowances of a gallon of ale, 8 pints. During harvest, this might increase to 1.5 gallons. No wonder medieval workers took frequent breaks. Brewing was primarily women's work, usually carried out at home. The process was straightforward. Heat water, add malted grain, remove the grain, add herbs for flavoring, and leave it to ferment. Most women brewed once or twice a week, storing the ale in wooden tubs before transferring it to pottery jugs or wooden barrels. Without refrigeration, ale spoiled quickly, usually within a week. Ale was genuinely a local product, brewed and consumed within the same community. It was also a constant household chore, as essential and frequent as bread making. Ale also served as a form of payment. Many work records show that laborers received payment in both money and ale. Building a section of the village wall might earn 3 pence plus 2 gallons of ale. Church bell ringers frequently received payment in ale rather than coins. And one English village paid its rat catcher with a weekly jug, perhaps to help him forget the day's work. For special events, peasants could enjoy stronger, more flavorful drinks. While cider and mead were special treats for the poor, they weren't luxury items. They were practical solutions for preserving food and providing rare sweetness in an otherwise monotonous diet. Cider was especially popular in apple-growing regions. Apple trees were highly advantageous for peasant farmers. Once planted, they produced fruit for decades with minimal care, and they could thrive on hillsides too steep for other crops. Mead made from fermented honey and water was the oldest known alcoholic beverage in Europe. But honey was expensive, and thus mead was much rarer than ale or cider for the average peasant. Some peasants maintained their own beehives, providing honey for both sweetening food and making small batches of mead. A single hive could yield 15 to 20 pounds of honey annually, a significant luxury for a peasant family. Beehives sometimes appeared in wills and marriage contracts alongside land and livestock, indicating their value. Honey served additional practical purposes. Medieval medical texts recommend it for wound healing and soothing coughs, and it was used to create hairstyles and even for hair removal. Its versatile applications made honey all the more precious. When small quantities of honey were available, peasants used it frugally, adding a drop to porridge, spreading a thin layer on bread, or creating a treat for a sick family member. Wild berries provided seasonal sweetness, requiring only the effort of gathering. Strawberries, blackberries, blueberries, and raspberries grew wild. Children were often sent in groups to collect them. Berries were not easily preserved without sugar, limiting them to the growing season. Berry picking was a community activity. Feast records reveal how special these treats were. Dishes featuring honey and berries frequently appeared at the end of meals for guests. For peasants invited to these rare feasts, a honey-sweetened berry dessert might have been a once-in-a-lifetime experience. When berries and honey were unavailable, medieval peasants turned to starchy alternatives like acorns and chestnuts. Medieval peasants were quite literally foraging for food. Acorns and chestnuts were valuable fallback foods when grain supplies dwindled, transforming forests into essential emergency pantries. Chestnuts were easier to prepare. They're naturally sweet and don't require extensive processing. In areas with chestnut forests, parts of France, Italy, and Spain, chestnuts were called the bread tree because they provided comparable starchy nutrition to grain. A bountiful chestnut harvest could save a village from winter hunger. In some villages, a household's wealth was partially assessed based on their access to chestnut trees. Chestnuts made up nearly 20% of the peasant diet in some parts of France during winter. A single large chestnut tree could yield up to 200 pounds of nuts annually, enough to sustain a family for weeks if grain supplies were low. Chestnuts were roasted, boiled, dried, and ground into flour that could be mixed with grain flour to stretch bread supplies. This flour didn't rise as well as wheat flour, but it filled bellies. Acorns required significantly more effort, but were also lifesavers during famines. The bitter tannins in raw acorns render them inedible unless processed. Medieval peasants developed methods for removing these tannins, repeatedly soaking crushed acorns in water, a process that consumed days and considerable water, but the resulting acorn meal could be mixed with grain flour to make a barely palatable emergency bread. During the great famines that periodically struck Europe, these tree nuts proved invaluable. Court records from the famine of 1315-1317 mention people fighting over access to nut-gathering grounds. Even during normal times, peasants carefully gathered and stored nuts as insurance against poor harvests. Dried properly, both acorns and chestnuts could last for years. One medieval farming manual recommends storing chestnuts in sand to prevent mold. The forest provided more than nuts. Medieval villages often had strict rules about who could harvest which wild foods and when, underscoring their crucial role in everyday survival. During desperate times, peasants turned to an even wider range of food sources. Medieval wild food gathering followed seasonal availability, with each month offering different options. Spring provided tender young greens like dandelions, nettles, and sorrel, appearing when food stores were at their lowest. Young nettles, despite their sting, were particularly valuable, rich in vitamins and minerals after the long winter of grain and preserved foods. Peasants used gloves or special techniques to harvest them and then boiled them to neutralize their sting. Summer expanded the available options, with numerous edible mushrooms appearing in meadows and woods, though identifying poisonous varieties was critical. Records from one village document a family dying after eating poisonous mushrooms during a famine. Safer options included wild garlic, chickweed, and lamb's quarters, all of which could augment pottage. Wild onion relatives grew abundantly, providing both nutrition and flavor during food shortages. Autumn offered nuts, rose hips, hawthorn berries, and crab apples, all rich in vitamin C and natural preservatives. These tart fruits weren't particularly delicious, but they could be stored for winter use, offering both medicinal benefits and flavoring. Medieval cookbooks mention these wild fruits as additions to more palatable dishes. Peasant women played a crucial role in foraging. Manor court records mention women renowned for their foraging skills, capable of locating edible mushrooms, identifying useful plants, and knowing the best wild fruit locations. They sometimes received payment for sharing their knowledge or leading gathering expeditions during times of hardship. In normal years, gathered plants might constitute 5 to 10% of peasant nutrition. During famines, this could rise to 30% or more. One account from the Great Famine describes villages surviving almost entirely on gathered greens and tree bark for weeks. Medieval law recognized the importance of these resources. Many forests and woodlands had gleaning rights that allowed peasants to collect wild foods, even on land they didn't own. Legal disputes over these rights frequently appear in court records. When even wild plants became scarce, desperation dictated resourcefulness. Ash cakes represented the last resort against starvation, a type of primitive bread requiring minimal ingredients and no specialized equipment. The concept was simple. Take any available ground meal, mix it with water to form a paste, flatten it into a cake, and cook it directly in hot ashes. No oven, baking stone, or even pot was needed, just fire, ash, and desperate necessity. During normal times, ash cakes were rarely consumed. They were strictly emergency food. But during the frequent famines that swept across medieval Europe, these unassuming cakes sustained countless people. Their adaptability made them essential. When wheat and rye were unavailable, any ground grain could be used: barley, oats, millet, or even pea flour. When all grain supplies were exhausted, resourceful substitutes such as ground acorns, dried and ground tree bark, Crushed roots or even ground hay were employed. Records from the famine of 1315-1317 describe peasants making ash cakes from dust swept from the granary floor, literally utilizing the leftover grain bits and dirt from emptied storehouses. The cooking method itself was ancient. Without ovens, many peasants already cooked flatbreads on heated stones. Ash cakes took this further, eliminating even the need for stones. Medieval texts advised brushing off the worst of the ashes before consumption, although gritty teeth were an occupational hazard. A notable advantage was their quick cooking time. Traditional bread required hours, but ash cakes could be ready in minutes, crucial when hunger and energy were low. Work songs sometimes mention ash cakes being made in fields during short work breaks. The taste was as one might expect from bread baked in ashes, smoky, often bitter, and sometimes literally containing ash. In the most extreme circumstances, even ash cakes might be impossible to make. This is where true improvisation came into play. The most typical medieval peasant meal wasn't a dish at all. It was whatever happened to be available, thrown together in a pot and deemed dinner. Medieval peasants were masters of kitchen improvisation long before it became a modern culinary trend. This use what's available approach wasn't just common, it was daily life. While manor house kitchens meticulously planned meals, peasant cooking rarely followed recipes, adhering to the simple principles of utilizing everything available, minimizing waste, and preparing something filling enough to sustain another day's hard labor. A typical whatever we have meal in spring might include foraged greens, leftover winter turnips, and a few dried peas. Summer might offer a mixture of garden vegetables with a small amount of bacon fat for flavor. Autumn could mean mushrooms and nuts added to cabbage. Winter often involved making do with whatever preserved foods remained. Cooking methods were equally flexible. A fire kept burning all day allowed for everything to be added to a pot and left to simmer. If fieldwork lasted until dark, ingredients might simply be left to simmer all day in a covered pot buried in hot ashes. If there was no time to cook at all, cold leftovers combined with a chunk of bread served as a meal. This flexible eating style was a result of necessity. During holidays and celebrations, even whatever we have meals were elevated, saved up special ingredients, a pinch of salt, rare spices, or the first fresh vegetables of spring, transformed ordinary mixed meals into something celebratory by peasant standards. A medieval French saying captures this perfectly: "The best sauce is hunger," implying that any food tastes good when you're genuinely hungry. Peasants, having experienced the hardships of medieval life, understood this better than anyone. Their creative, resource-driven approach to cooking wasn't just about survival. It was the original farm-to-table cuisine, shaped by the seasons, necessity, and remarkable human adaptability.